Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the latest webinar in our series, Support Consultation on the Draft Money and Pension Service Standards that will underpin the Pensions Dashboards ecosystem. Delighted to be here again. Many of you who've been to the first couple of these will recognise me, but my name is Richard James, and I am the Programme Director for the Pensions Dashboards Programme within the Money and Pensions Service. For today's webinar, the panel is slightly different to those we've had before. Delighted to be joined by Gary Miller, Helen Scrimminger, Chris Connolly, who will be talking you through some of the detailed content today and helping answer some of your questions as well as we go. We are delighted to launch the consultation on standards. It is really important milestone for the PDP and another really big step in our delivery. It follows our successful build of the central technical architecture over the course of the past 12 months or so that will make the dashboards possible. And last month we completed the test of that architecture and successfully sent information from one end to the other within the test environment using synthetic data. And a dashboard user managed to find that synthetic data online for the very first time. So we're making tremendously good progress on the build of the architecture and the technology that will underpin pensions dashboards. This consultation on the draft standards is another really big step for us in that journey towards dashboards becoming a reality, and crucially in providing all of you in industry more clarity on what is going to be required to make the dashboards ecosystem work. We hope you've had a bit of an opportunity to have a look at the draft materials we published for consultation. We really do strongly encourage you to respond. We are very keen to hear your views on what we are asking about in this consultation. So please do take the time to let us have your thoughts. We look forward to hearing those. And as I say, I remember the material we're publishing here gives you that bit more certainty and clarity exactly how dashboards are likely to work. So I'll give you a little bit of a flavour of what we're planning to cover in this, the third and final webinar in the series. So we'll be covering the areas of design standards this morning, where you will recall we are running a call for input on the design standards rather than a consultation on the draft content of design standards themselves. That allows us to then run a further consultation exercise later on in the year around those design standards. We will also be covering the data standards this morning, where we are consulting on the draft content of those standards and the same reporting standards as well. And of course, as with previous webinars, we'll have an opportunity for questions and answers later on in the session. So please do put any questions that you have as we go into the questions box ready for that session at the end, and as many answers as possible. As ever, if we don't quite manage to get through all of them, we will be publishing questions and answers at the end of the webinar. And again, as with previous webinars, we will be recording the webinar and publishing the recording on the website as well, so that you can look back on it, and anybody who can't be here can also get access to that information. And as with previous webinars, again, we'll give you just a very quick overview of where we go next when we get to the end of the session. Webinar purpose and focus. Let's give you a little bit of a sense of what we are doing today. So the intent is to support the consultation, give you a bit more of that context around the explanation of the deluge of documents that we have just published, help you orientate yourself among them all, and just explain that little bit more about what you can find in each of those documents. Obviously, the first webinar we gave you, an overview of the consultation approach, and yesterday we spent some more time on some of the connection issues. Today we are covering the standards which apply to participating in the ecosystem itself. So a little bit more wider program context before we get into the detail of that. You will probably be aware that the PDPs develop and test September and runs until the end of this summer. And that incorporated an initial discovery phase and then an alpha build phase in which we have built the central digital architecture that will connect individuals up to their pensions via dashboards. Today we're on the last in this series of webinars to support our consultation on draft standards and guidance, and today we'll be providing an overview of information requirements covering what pension providers should provide, what dashboards should display, and what reporting both pension providers and dashboard providers will need to make when participating in the dashboard's ecosystem. And again, yes, that first webinar focused on the consultation overview and talked about our proposals for approach to governance. If you weren't able to make that one, I'd encourage you to take a look, because it provides you with a really good overview. The second one yesterday focused on connecting to the ecosystem and the standards and guidance that pension providers and dashboard providers will need to follow to achieve that connection. Once again, we're in the same format today, so it's not going to be a page turn exercise or a detailed explanation of each proposed requirement within the draft standards. Rather, again, we're going to be providing what we're helpful overview of the consultation and all of the draft documents to help you orientate yourself to them, understand the context, and understand what's where, and crucially to help you respond so we can get as possible. So we will then have a Q&A session at the end to provide any further information, context, etc. And we'll be once again prioritizing those questions that relate to explaining our consultation to help you to be able to respond. Anything we miss, we'll get to at the end. And the same reminder for this one as previously, which is that the standards that we are talking about here are in draft. Open to change, and we are very keen to have those thoughts from you to help inform that. So we'll get started with the content on the design standards. So I will hand over to Chris Connolly, who's going to walk you through the first of those sections of content. Chris, thank you.
Morning, everyone. I'm going to start you off with design standards. Thank you, Carolyn. So the design standards apply to the display of pensions information on dashboards. Simple as that. Although the standards themselves will not be that simple. We've issued a call for input. As Richard said, everything else is consultation on the detail. The design standards are a bit more seeking input from the rest of industry. The critical thing is to have a look at what we're asking you and see if you have any views and whether you have evidence to back up those views. The process that we're going to take is through a threefold track here, which is shown on the slide. So the call for input is where we are today. And then we will review what those responses are through the rest of autumn. And then there'll be a formal consultation after that. And then we'll review the consultation responses. So that's the main track for the documentation. The qualifying pension dashboards, that's the QPDS initialization here, will have a regulatory framework base that will be overseen by the FCA. So in parallel to the standards themselves, there'll be consultation on the regulatory framework over who can be a dashboard and how they need to behave. And then they will publish their regulatory framework in parallel. And all of this is underpinned by extending user research. So user research has been going on for a while now, where we've been testing various aspects of usability, various aspects of understandability of various screen designs, including the security journey going through ID&V, and now focusing on the display of pensions elements and which one seems to go well, which ones do not seem to go well. All of that user research will inform the other two work streams on the standards process. Next slide, please, Caroline. Okay, so there's three main areas we're actually looking at. There is some general stuff about where the display logic is permitted. You will have seen a lot of toing and froing when the legislation was originally being laid about whether dashboards could do calculations and what constitutes a calculation. So we'll be very clear on the fact that you can actually use display logic to help present the data better in a dashboard. That is not the same as running calculations on the data. They will not, the design standards will not replicate existing legal or regulatory requirements. So they're not going to overwrite, nor are they going to repeat what is said elsewhere about things like such as disclosure, for example. And then when we're looking at where it affects the users, we need to make sure that there's broadly a consistent experience. As you'll be aware, there are multiple dashboards possible. There'll be one MAPS dashboard and other commercial dashboards. So we need to make sure the design standards show that no matter what dashboard the consumer uses, they see the same information. It might be laid out slightly differently, but it should be broadly consistent. We also need to make sure that we are managing the levels of consumer protection and making sure there is consumer comprehension. And there will also be design standards expecting you to make your services accessible. And where in balance, the needs of the users should outweigh those of the dashboard itself, where there is tension between the two. And then looking at the qualifying dashboards themselves, then we'll be looking at principle-based rather than necessarily laying out every single requirement, as long as we make sure we're very clear on consumer protection and user needs. A lot of it, you'll imagine, is kind of going to be along the lines of there are things you must do as a dashboard, there are things you must not do as a dashboard, and everything in between is based on principles of consumer protection and user need, and information and explanation. Other decisions, will just need to be consistency within a requirement framework. So how information is presented, the branding's not going to be too specific on that, but there will be guidelines within which you can work. And there'll be some choices, whether you actually display the information that's provided to you as monthly amounts, weekly amounts, yearly amounts, will be choices you will be allowed to make. There will be some constraints for some types of pensions. And then equally, whether you want to provide the information as a grid of information, as a table, as a graph, both, these will be choices you'll be allowed to make within certain guidelines. Next one, please. So in terms of where the design standards impact upon the individual user journey, then where the design standards, we've called them steps 1, 3, and 4 here. So step 1 is where our member, our individual, is arriving at their chosen dashboard. The CD interface is where it's stepping out to do things like the ID and V checks to prove Mr. James is Mr. James, and gathering consents for that sort of thing, because there is one standard service for that, so the design standards don't need to cover that part. And then once the central digital architecture has done its bit, the design standards again show how those control how those search results should be displayed or should not be displayed. And then the steps on into the ongoing pages and ongoing display of information. So those are the areas affected by the design standards. And breaking that down into a little bit more information, sort of unpacked each stage. So there will be design issues around explaining the dashboard service and the function of what's going on in the central digital architecture. Controls around setting up of a user account or using an existing account. Handling how it's handed over into the central digital architecture step, that's step 2, and how we get that information back. What to show while we're waiting for the view results, because they might not all be instantaneous. So what should you do there? How you might display the view results in summary, how you might display the view results in more detail, displaying important warnings. And then lastly, in the step 4, where else do you go? So hand off into other materials, hand off into other processes, and making any other available links if they need further help. So turning to the request for input itself, so the call for input, then the questions we are asking, as I mentioned at the start of this section, do you actually have any input relating to how we are developing policy on design standards? And if your input can be backed by evidence, then all the better. It is really helpful to not just get opinion, but actually get evidence of where things have been tried before, what works, what doesn't work. That becomes really, really helpful. Do you think we've omitted anything in setting out what we think we need to make a standard and what we don't need to make a standard? Do you agree with the principles-based approach? And do you think if there is tension, we are right to favour user needs over the pension dashboard's needs if there is conflict or if there is tension? And I shall leave that there and take questions later. And with barely pause for breath, I will take you through the data standards. So the data standards, many of you will have seen before. This is the one set of documents that we have published almost 2 years ago. The first version of this was issued. So the data standards itself, this is the first time you will have seen the documents themselves split out into three. So the main one, the data standards, is the document that is referred to from legislation, and it basically covers what form all that pensions data must take when you're sending it into the dashboard architecture. So it's aimed at the people sending the data, i.e. data providers, pension schemes, insurers, pension providers. But it is also useful to people who are building their own qualifying pensions dashboard, because they'll need to understand what the payload is that they are being sent. So the data standard sets out the alphanumeric format, the codes that are allowed to be used, and how the data must be sent. There is controls that are described in the Word document are also enforced through the JSON schema itself, the JSON schema being the technical language used to provide the data. And if you go and look in the technical package, you'll see the sample JSON schema is in there as well. So that's a fourth document you can refer to if you have any queries. And then what we have split out from the data standards, which is a slightly more technical document, is a document more aimed at pension schemes, business analysts, that sort of skill set, about the usage guide, so a bit more descriptive of what and how things should be used, where they go in the structure of the documents, help you understand at a business level rather than an IT technical level what's going on with data. And then from feedback from lots of various working groups and some of the questions and Q&As we've been receiving on the pension dashboard program's data email address, which you'll see on the final slide at the end, we've come up with an appendix of examples of how you might choose to use the data usage. And I say might because once you actually get into it, you'll realize that because we've got to be quite flexible to support up to the 12 subdivisions of the pensions industry that dashboards needs to surface data for, that there are quite a lot of choices within the data structure. So have a read of that, have a read of the examples, and just see if any of those help you understand the more technical detail. So just as an example, and you'll see this at the start of the standards document, it's also repeated in the usage guide, just a simple table describing what all the data elements are for, and also giving you an indication of whether that data item is mandatory or conditional or optional. Conditional means that there will be a condition that means that that data might sometimes be mandatory, or otherwise conditional, or otherwise not needed, otherwise optional or not needed at all. So we're taking a really simple example here of an example of the table. So here we've got some of the information that you send back about the contact information for the team that actually look after the pension administration. So here, very simple stuff: name, contact preference, URL, etc. So one example of the conditions, which are explained in more details in the standard, will be things like email. So if you've set that second item, the contact preference, to be email, then that makes the email field mandatory. So that's a simple example of how conditions work. More information is in the technical standard. Moving on to an example from the data standard, you'll see that data element item, the admin contact preference, laid out in more detail. So for every single data element, there is a table like this explaining the structure, and also whether there's any cross-references or any constraints around how you use it. This one's very simple. It's a 1-character text field of fixed values, and the allowable fixed values are listed at the bottom there. It shows that the contact preference is a mandatory field, and multiplicity means how often can I use this field. So in this occasion, it's mandatory and you can only use it once. So you have one preference and then you can set that. There'll be lots of other more complicated fields than this when you get into the information, but do read any validation. That's what's checking what's going in the field. It might be telling you that it's going to be checked against a separate field just to make sure they make sense referentially. But the multiplicity will also show you how often you can use it. When you start looking at benefit information, for example, you want to look at the accrued pension or the estimated retirement income, then you'll see that that's actually allowed to repeat up to 10 times to cover those really complicated benefit bases some of you have been telling us about. But in this example, this is where it shows that you must send one and only one. Thank you, Caroline. So what are we asking you now in consultation? So we've gone into quite a lot of detail and data because we've lived with this standard for almost 2 years now, so you should be quite familiar with it, and now we're getting down to the final clarifications of detail. So the main question we really want to ask is that there is actually quite a lot of flexibility and choice within the data structure for providing benefit information. So please have a look at the example and come back to us if you think you've got a benefit structure that you can't still see how to adequately explain via sending numbers through the data standard. Will it cover your benefit structure? Is there something out there we haven't thought of that's not already covered in the appendices? It might well be that we can still support it and we will add examples to the appendices. If not, then do feedback and we'll work out how we can handle it. The next point is specific about how we handle warnings about benefits. We get that you all produce benefit statements every year, and so have pages and pages of caveats and warnings about various numbers, but actually produce all of that on a dashboard. Bear in mind that your pension information will be alongside potentially 5, 6, 7 other pension providers' information. So how can we make the really important warnings clear? So have a look at what we've added into the accrued section, which is all the numbers starting 2.3, and the estimated retirement income, which are all the data fields starting 2.4, and have a look at the warnings. So for example, there's a warning in there already for where you've produced a number, but there is a pension sharing order. So you might want to flag those up. So have a look at those, have a look at the common reasons you might want to provide other common warnings, but please bear in mind we can't support a whole library of scheme-specific warnings. That will just not be understandable to members. And again, bear in mind your data is alongside other providers' data. But on reflection of that, we have been asking various organisations as part of our research as to, rather than rely on a small constrained set of warnings, would the ability to add a short piece of free format text be preferable? Now, the initial feedback, I should tell you, was that that might be quite the maintenance overhead to make sure you've got that and maintain it, and make it understandable when the members see that alongside other people's data. So it hasn't been met with uniform acceptance, but we are interested in broadening the scope through consultation to get more opinion. Do you think that would work, or is it just too much work? And then lastly, again, thinking about effort. So one of the pension items is called the pensions link. That piece of information is designed so that if you've got 2 separate administrators separately sending in benefit information for a member, and you want them visually linked on the screen, then there needs to be this pension link flag. So one of the most common examples will be the DB pension scheme sending its information in, and then the insurer sending in the ABCs related to that pension scheme. They can both use this pension link field with the same unique value in it, and therefore the person designing the dashboard front screen will know that those 2 pieces of information need to be displayed together. Without it, then it will be just up to the individual sort order choices of the dashboard design as to whether those pensions turn up side by side, could turn up 4 or 5 pensions apart from each other. Is that a problem for member understanding? Is that a problem that will cause you a lot of work? So what we're trying to take your views on, once you've understood what the proposal is for this pension link field, is it easy enough that you can create this unique identifier, and we explain in the standards how you do it, and then pass that unique identifier to your ABC provider to use as well on your behalf? Or actually, is that a lot of work? Is that going to be a problem, an undue burden? And if that information didn't exist to link those 2 benefits together, would it cause you more work if we suddenly got a lot of confused members seeing pensions and ABCs separate from each other on the screen? A lot to take in on that question, but please read the proposals, please read what we're suggesting about the pension link field to understand it, and then sit back and have a think about, is it more work to do that, or is it more work to pick up with the fallout of potential member queries? I think that's me done.
Thank you, Chris. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about reporting standards. These will be applicable to both pension providers and qualifying and data providers. We're collecting this information for both PDP, FCA and TPR. And the aim of the standards is to be clear about what information we must be generated and then sent through to us, when and how. Regulators may, however, have their own reporting requirements, which won't be detailed in these. This will sit alongside other standards, which will have information, more information on requirements. So what's in it? Well, broadly speaking, the needs of reporting split into 3 groups: audit or business audit, ecosystem protective monitoring, and ecosystem insight. So business audit is generally used for non-repudiation purposes in order to understand something that may or may not have gone wrong. Protective monitoring, akin to cyber monitoring, is to make sure that that the central architecture is protected at all times, and we're alerted of any threats to that architecture. Operational monitoring has got more to do with the performance of the central architecture and the performance of the participants in it. With the insight, this is a mixture of the oversight reporting that's required for regulators and PDP to provide oversight, and management information that will provide stats effectively on the use of the service and inform continuous improvement. So on this slide is an example of a few of the pieces of detail that will be an example of that detail. But in essence, we're naming the source. Who does this apply to? Who needs to provide this information? The event. What information is it that triggers the need to send it? And what does it relate to? Which area does it satisfy the need? And what is the frequency? We're also looking at the method. So most of will be the outline of the API method to be called for you to push data to. So that was very much a whistle-stop tour. Please, I would encourage you to read through the reporting standards, and we are keen to understand your insights and your thoughts on the breadth of the information we're asking for, whether you foresee any technical barriers to providing that information for any of the 3 categories, and the frequency. So some of those feeds are near real time, but with the oversight and management information, that's to provide daily. Do you have any thoughts about or suggestions how we should achieve our aims? Thank you, and I'll hand back to Richard.
Superb, thank you very much. So we're now into the question and answer portion of the webinar, and we'll launch straight into some of the questions we received. As ever, if you've still got questions, please do get them captured in that questions box. We'll get through as many as we possibly can. So Helen, I'll stay with you for the first question that we've got, which is, will there be a need to retain data at either the QPDS or the data provider?
Yes, so we have provision within the standard where we may need to see data, particularly transaction level data for non-repudiation, but we don't need to receive it for every transaction. So it's in the event of a dispute, we're asking participants to retain that data.
Super, and I think the standards are clear on where we're asking them to do that. That's tremendous. Let's turn to the design standards. And Chris, I'll come to you with this one. So we've been running a consultation on the design standards as well, and if so, when do we expect that to take place?
Thank you. I think we showed when we're on the slides in a timeline, the consultation on the design documents themselves plan to run in parallel with the FCA consultation on the regulatory requirements, what they expect to police in that. So that will be later on after we've done this first call for input.
Super, thank you, Chris. Yeah, so plenty of opportunity to influence that. Chris, I'll stay with you. Will pension providers be compelled to supply data to all of the eventual dashboards that arise?
Yeah, so all the legislation on providing the data is blanket, irrespective of what dashboard is being used. So if you have to provide the data, you have to provide the data.
Super, thank you. And I'll stay with you, Chris, as well. We've been asked, do all dashboards need to follow the standards? And particularly, do we have any concerns about differences in appearance across the different dashboards?
I think there are concerns as to how you set the level of the standards in the right way, that not only make sure that we're providing the consumer protections, but also allowing commercial dashboards to do what they do best, which is understand their own members, understand their own customer base, and communicate with them. The MAP service has the unenviable task of producing something that is accessible to all. Whereas commercial dashboard can choose just to target particular cohorts that it knows its customer base are in, but equally that gives them the ability to sort of move into how they think data gets presented well, use their own experience on what gets across to their customers, what they understand, how they want to present their information. So it is a fine balancing act, and that always gives you concerns. But I think ultimately in a multi-dashboard market, which will be the first country doing this to be a multi-dashboard, I think it's important that we set principles based for the actual standards.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. And a big part of the consultation we are running here, of course, is trying to get a sense from you of whether we have set those standards at the right level to get enough uniformity to deliver that consumer protection while still leaving enough of that room for dashboards to adapt. A very specific question here. There's a reference to conditional data items within the standards at 2.104. And so the question is, what does that conditional actually mean? So can we just quickly explain that?
Yeah, so I think 2104, I think, is the administrator email. So the condition is that if you've set your preference, your communication preference channel to be email, then you must provide the email. Kind of just common sense in the message structure. Other conditions might be relying on something else. So when you get into the values, you'll discover some things are conditional, and that condition is very simply, is it a DC benefit or a DB benefit? Because some numbers are irrelevant to one, not the other. So for that specific one, 2104, it just says if you want people to communicate with you by email, give them the email address.
Super, thank you, Chris. The next question we've been asked is thanks for all the publication of these publications and webinars. The design standards call for information, a rough and ready total estimated income. And there's a sense here that we to many of them, so that total estimated income. And so what is PDP's thinking on this? And there's recognition that it's not a simple question, but it is one that we know some people might want to see. Chris, would you like to offer some observations on that one?
Certainly. I think what the standards are setting out to do is to be facilitating of these things. It will be the inputs like this and feedback and evidence from members. If they want to see that, or the customers want to see that, then that's important information that we should get. So we're open to information being tabular, we're open to information being presented graphically to aid understanding. So we'd just be interested to hear that as feedback, and then we'll make sure that we can work out how best to govern the sort of consumer protections within that structure.
Super, thank you, Chris. Hopefully that helped with that one. Are we able to confirm what has changed between the recently published data standards and those that were released in draft in January? Chris, I'll stay with you for this one.
Yeah, there is a summary document on the website that shows the change between what we issued back in January and the one that's just gone out now.
Okay, super, thank you. And do keep these questions coming. Hopefully we're getting through lots of them, so if you've still got questions, please do log them in the questions box here. So next one is, my worry is that most pension savers don't read lots of what is issued to them. Are you concerned that putting lots of warnings and commentary that it may confuse savers or put them off using the dashboard? Helen, should we come to you for this one?
Sorry, you surprised me there, Richard. It's a fine balance. One of the reasons for thinking about providing design standards was to make sure that any messaging we gave to the consumer was clear and meant something to them. So that's why, to a certain extent, we're doing a call for impact, so we can gather more information on that.
Super. Thank you. Right, I think we've got a couple of very technical questions that we might need to pick up in the publication afterwards. Are there any other questions out there at the moment? It's a great opportunity to get the experts answering those. Let's pick up on, oh, we've got one here. Whose responsibility is it to provide the reporting data? Helen, let's come to you.
So as with most of the pensions dashboard, the responsibility falls to either the regulated firm or the scheme regulated by TPR. But they can choose to ask their third-party provider to provide that data to the central architecture. And so in all practicality, most people who are choosing to connect to the central architecture will use an ISP, and the ISP is likely to provide that data to us on your behalf. But the obligation still sits with the scheme and the firm.
Yeah, thank you, Helen. And in yesterday's webinar, those of you who were here for that will have heard us talking quite a bit about the importance of looking at that relationship with your ISP, selecting the right organisation to partner with. And I think this is another good example of those things that you would need to be thinking about and testing when looking at those commercial relationships that you as schemes and administrators might well be forming with ISPs, to make sure that they are set up to provide all that information on your behalf. And Helen, a follow-up on that one. Why can't the central digital architecture provide that information on behalf of schemes and administrators?
So some of the anyway, if you've looked at the technical architecture recently, you'll see that there are some elements that the central architecture just won't know by design. So it carries no personal information, whilst none of the reporting requires any personal information. Some of it does require you to know something about the individual. So the central architecture won't have that. And in the case of a view, in some cases, the central architecture wouldn't actually be involved. So the request will go straight from a dashboard to a data provider. So the only people in a position to provide information are either a dashboard or a data provider.
Thank you, Helen. Excellent. Chris, I'm going to come back to you for the next one. So what sort of disclaimers do you expect to appear on the dashboards? And are they covered in any of the standards that are currently being consulted on? If not, when do you intend to consult on this?
Okay, so I think the principal disclaimer, almost the only one you can say is truly generic, is that we expect the design standards to say that you need to make it very clear to the consumer that what they are seeing is estimates. They might not even be recent estimates, given you're allowed to provide information that may be up to 12 months old, and that they should not take action without first seeking more information from each of those providers. So we expect that to be truly generic, so don't act without checking, sort of thing. Some of the warnings that we're asking you about in the data standards, that again is what we're trying to get at. What is the right level of information that you really want to alert someone to say, you know, there's a potential landmine here, don't tread on this without doing something, without having to portray every single scheme's warnings and errors that they produce in their benefit statements every year. We tried capturing that during the data working groups over 18 months ago, and I think when we wrote them all down, I think they filled about 4 sides of A4 just with the codes of what people wanted to express. So again, another piece of fine line, and I take the other questions point that we had earlier. They put too many in and they won't be read anyway, so what was the point? Hence why we're trying to find that right balance of what are the smallest number of really important warnings to get across that is different to just call me before you do anything daft. And would that help if it was just a short piece of text instead? And I think that's where all these concerns come from. You know, the more you put in, the less people read.
Yeah, Super, thank you, Chris. And I'll stay with you because we're still on data standards for this next one. So the data standards are very detailed and have an administration focus. Should trustees of schemes with complex benefit structures be asking their outsourced administrators to check and confirm during the consultation period that there are no issues?
Absolutely, and I think there is plenty of guidance out there already. So, and if you've been looking at the PASA information, PLSA information, and also what's on the data providers hub on the MAPS website, you will see there are lots of indications as to please understand what data you are compelled to provide. Please check you've got it. Please check it's in a digital format so it's readily shareable and not sitting in a paper file somewhere. So there are lots and lots of pointers out there to help you get through that work. But absolutely, whoever is familiar with your data, who works with it day in, day out, should be able to tell you what position you are in.
Super, thank you, Chris. Helen, I'll come across to you for the next one, which is a question about how the architecture will operate. So if a member signs up with multiple dashboards, will a common data collection system call for the information once, or will the same data have to be provided multiple times?
So the same, the answer is both, basically. The pension owner will be sent to the central architecture and their identification checked. And then if there are any PEIs, they'll be asked to consent for that dashboard to see them, but that doesn't mean they give their consent. So it's a combination of the two. I can give you in the answer I'll give a fuller explanation, but ostensibly we'll only do a find for new pensions rather than keep doing a refind.
Great, thank you, Helen. We're also being asked, would it be open to commercial dashboard providers to include information about other products, for example, lifetime ISAs, if they make it clear that that's not part of the dashboard? And I think it's fair to say that the rules on that dashboard advertising, I won't put this across to the panel because this is actually more of a question for the FCA. The rules on dashboard advertising will be covered when the FCA consults on the overall regulatory framework for pensions dashboards provision. So let's keep going. We've got a few more minutes, I think, where we can keep working through some questions. So we are being asked, will there be any guidance that summarizes all of the optional duties that an ISP could cover for a pension scheme? Chris, shall I come to you with that one?
I'm not sure what we've planned to actually produce from the programme, but I think what is very clear, and I'll have to put my other hat to one side where I sell ISPs on other days of the week. It's very clear from the legal requirements what is needed. So, but that legal accountability, as Helen said earlier, falls on the scheme or the scheme manager or the trustees. So you need to make sure that if you are buying any third-party service, be it admin, be it the ISP or a software widget, then you need to do your due diligence that they know that they are keeping you compliant. But I don't think that the programme itself will produce anything of that nature because it's clear from the standards what have to be met.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. And it's probably worth playing this back to some of the conversation that we had at yesterday's webinar as well, in which Lucy Stone from the pensions regulator was talking about TPR looking at what information they might be able to provide for schemes around how to engage with ISPs. But fundamentally, that responsibility for entering into the right commercial relationship, deciding the shape of that relationship, and ensuring that the ISP is a good fit for your scheme, your administrator, is one that rests with the scheme. Okay, we're being asked, can we give an update on how many commercial dashboards that we are expecting? Helen, shall I come to you?
Well, we're not expecting a huge amount initially, but it's a new market, and we would hope that that the market would expand to basically fulfill the needs of their customers. If you want to provide your customers with whole of wallet, which is like the nirvana, then pension forms a large part of that. So we would hope that dashboards will actually seize that opportunity and create a new market for them.
Super, thank you very much. Right, we are approaching the end of the questions that we have been asked, I think. We are being asked, can we confirm what time period is covered by the autumn, where we talk about consulting or finalising the designs, the standards later in the autumn, and also consulting on the formal design standards later in the autumn. I'm afraid we can't be much more accurate than that at the moment, because we are reliant on a few other things in order to make that happen, including particularly for the design standards, we are reliant on the FCA consultation around the overall regulatory framework. We do expect that to appear later, but of course, we all know these things sometimes. Government timetables can move around a little bit depending on what's happening, but we expect it to be, around that sort of later period this year, sort of November, December-ish sort of time, when we're likely to see some of that. But as I say, hard to be more specific than that at the moment. Right. I think we are just about at the end of the questions that we have received. Are there any others that anybody wants to submit? Just give you a moment or two in which to do that before we wrap up. Okay. So as ever, please do feel free to get in touch with us at the outside of the webinar environment, and we do look forward to hearing your comments from the consultation, of course. So a quick view as to what happens next on the back of all of this. We've obviously heard lots and lots of useful questions today and in the other earlier webinars as well. A reminder that the recordings of all of those webinars are available on our website, and we will also be publishing the questions and answers very soon. A further encouragement to really engage with that materials, get the relevant people in your organisations to review and to respond to the consultation. The most important date for all of this is the 30th of August, which is when this consultation exercise will close. And again, we recognise that is a consultation taking place over the summer, and we apologise for that. We are really, really keen to give you as much certainty as early as we can, which is why we are pushing to do this quite rapidly. But we do recognise that summer consultation can be a bit difficult for you, so my thanks to all of you who are engaging with this. And then this is the timeline beyond that point. You can see we're on that second stage at the moment, consulting on the draft standards. And then following our consultation, the closure of that on the 30th of August, we will be finalising the standards and then consulting on those draft design standards in the autumn. And then once the legislation is in place, which we expect to be around about November, December time, parliamentary time allowing, we will then publish the final standards, other than those design standards, which will follow on that slightly slower timetable. So it gives you a bit of a sense of where we go from here. A massive thank you from me for all of you for attending the latest in the webinar. Please do keep in touch with the programme. We publish regular updates on our website, on LinkedIn and on Twitter, and we do look forward to receiving your consultation responses. For now, however, thank you very much, and we look forward to hearing from you soon.